So section 1.3 is somewhat sarcastically called a brief history of life on Earth. Um, we're going to talk about the last 4.5 billion years or so of history of life on Earth, and we'll even at the beginning here look at the origin of the universe. So when I say brief, we're going to, in the next three lectures covering a little bit over an hour, we're going to cover 13.8 billion years of history. So we're really only hitting the highlights. So if we skip over your favorite historical or geological, paleontological event, of necessity, we're just going to be hitting the highlights that are critical and important for life on Earth and evolution. And so really this is a summary. As your reading assignment for today, I have given you a very in-depth and detailed history table of how humans classify and name different periods, epochs, eras in geological history. Don't freak out and feel like you have to memorize all of that. On the SLO for today's material, for Unit 1.3, you'll see a very abbreviated, modified version of that geological history with highlights in red of the dates you need to memorize and the major changes that you need to know. And so at the beginning of Unit 1.33, I'll look at that and give you a little bit more detail, but you should at least skim over and read look at the geological time period in all of its detail and glory. I'll ask you a couple questions that you'll need to submit for today's reading assignment credit. Okay, so let's start with the first, of course, major event that we know about, which is the origin of our universe. Now, this is a fairly well-established date. We get it from observing our visible universe. However, realize that we know very little about the actual origin of the universe, what conditions were like prior, if there was even anything we could measure or call a universe prior to that. There are theories about multiverses and other universes and cycles versus continuous expansion into chaos. We really don't know. But luckily for us, that's not a topic for this class. That's astrophysics, the history of the universe. So all you need to know is how old the universe is, what our estimates are, and what the data is that we use to get that. And for each of these major dates that I'm asking you to know, you need to know those two things. Number one, what the date is, and number two, what data we are using to establish that date. So our universe is dated at just under 14 billion years old. That's B, all right, that's BYA, billion years ago, right? So not millions, but billions of years ago. So about 13.8 billion years ago, there was this massive event where all of the matter that is in the known universe, which was once packed into this very dense cluster, suddenly rapidly expanded, sometimes affectionately called the Big Bang. Maybe rapid expansion is a better term. And again, we don't know what the characteristics were like before that. Probably the physical laws of our universe as we know it didn't apply. But at least our universe, as we know it, as we measure it, began about 14 billion years ago, a little less. Now, the data that we're using to do that is by watching the stars in our visible universe. And what astronomers noticed is that there were these certain types of stars that had very distinct characteristics, and they could use those characteristics to measure how far away those stars were. And what they noticed is that the farther away these stars were, the faster they were moving. And so this led to this idea of us being part of a very rapidly expanding universe coming out from a central point. And so things that are relatively close that are moving along with us we measure at fairly low speeds, but things that are far away get measured at high speeds. So the data we use to establish the date of the universe is the rate of expansion of our visible universe. And again, when we calculate back using all those different methods, we get this date of 13.8 billion years. So we're going to fast forward now to the origin of our own Earth. I'm going to talk just very briefly about how solar systems form. Now, for a long time, we only had evidence from our solar system, but now we're gathering data from other solar systems, and it seems to be fairly consistent, and we don't know how different other solar systems are, but this seems to be fairly consistent. A cluster of matter in this rapidly expanding universe begins to cluster together and pull together because of the force of gravity. The lighter stuff seems to form in the middle, hydrogen, helium primarily, and a few other trace elements. And that causes, as all of that gets pulled together by gravity, there's enough of it that we create a star. And so the star's fusion reactions occur, and we get this hot ball of gas, sending off light and radiation, and that's a star. In that cluster, as it's moving around, the heavier elements seem to cluster around the inner part of orbiting that star. And so we tend to get rocky planets in that inner cluster. And again, this is our solar system, but it seems to be fairly consistent with the limited data we have of solar systems other than ours. So our planet began as a cluster of heavy materials, iron, silicon, all these great, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, all these great things that we have that make up our current planet, all clustered together from gravity. They fused into a ball planet orbiting the sun. And so as we look at the inner part of our solar system, we see these rocky planets, right? We've got Mercury, we've got Venus, we've got Earth, we've got Mars, and those make up the rocky clusters. And so Earth began as one of those. Now, outside of that, as solar systems form, we have the lighter elements, and so we get gas giants that seem to form in this more outer ring. And so Saturn, Jupiter, Neptune, those are our gas giants. And then there's asteroids and clusters of smaller planets. And again, that seems to be maybe a fairly common theme with some variations, but we're still studying extra solar, right, outside of our sun's radius, other planets orbiting other suns. And so we don't know if consistently if that's all the time what happens, but in our solar system it did. Okay, so that's a general overview. Now, our Earth, as it formed, left distinct signals about when that occurred. And the signals that we use for this are given by igneous rocks. These are rocks that are formed as the rock melts and then is pushed up to the surface or cools under the surface and forms rocks. And that's a fairly consistent process. When we melt the rocks, we get this pool of magma, molten lava. And our pools of magma have a very consistent signature of radiation. We'll look at how we do that dating in a little bit. Okay, but that dating allows us to look at rocks that formed a long time ago, and if we use that basic starting point, we can estimate how old those rocks were. Because as those rocks solidify, the radioactive material in them begins to decay. So the date, when we look at the oldest igneous rocks on Earth, we get a date of about 4.5 billion years. So our Earth planet formed as a recognizable entity, as a planet orbiting our sun about 4.5 billion years ago. And we know that the data we use to support that data are the radioactive dating of the very oldest igneous rocks that we can find on Earth. Okay, so about 4.5 billion years ago, we have a recognizable planet. Now, this early planet was very, very different from our modern planet. And we're just going to talk about a few things that were different. Number one, the surface temperature of that planet was much higher than it is today. And so the Earth in general, this is over 4.5 billion years, has been generally cooling down. But there have been periods where it's heated up and cooled down. But in general, we see this trend cooling. Also at this time, meteorites were incredibly common. So this is an image of a particular type of a meteorite. And this is because the process of planet formation was still ongoing. And so early on, we have all of this amount of dust, rock, and ice orbiting the proto-sun or the early sun. And it begins to coalesce and form a planet. And that accretion process, which you can kind of think of as like a gravity vacuum, right? Pulling up all the material in its orbit as it circles the sun again and again, took a long time and is actually still going. We still have meteorites, but they're much, much less common now because we've already pulled in by our planet's gravity most of the material that is in our immediate orbit. But at this early stage, meteorites were very, very common, brought in lots of ice, probably form as the source for much of the water that forms our modern oceans, and lots of other material. And today we still have meteorites, but they're less common. Also, early Earth was much more geologically active. It was less stable. We don't know much about continents and whether they were same as today or continental stuff has reformed, but certainly there were many, many volcanoes, underwater rifts with spewing magma, a very active geological planet. And it's still somewhat active, but much less so than it was at that time. So if you know those three things, those are the keys for what prebiotic, that is before there was life on Earth, what it was like. And if you were to be able to transport yourself back to prebiotic Earth, you probably wouldn't recognize it. It would look like some inhospitable planet. You wouldn't be able to breathe the air. The gases were in the atmosphere were very different than they were today. And so it would look like an alien planet. But eventually all of the changes would take place to bring it to our current state. So in this early atmosphere, there were methane, hydrogen, ammonia, water. Those were common elements, and lots of other elements too at smaller amounts. Now, if you look at this, we see these in our modern environment, our modern atmosphere, but at different ratios. Still lots of water, still hydrogen and methane in our atmosphere. Very little ammonia, although it's there, but in smaller amounts than it was early on. But if we look at these elements, these are the basic building blocks for living organisms. Right? To have living organisms, we need carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And notice that it's all there. Now, there are other gases, and today our atmosphere is quite different. But these are major components of our early Earth's atmosphere. And people have looked at this and done these experiments where they zap a approximation of Earth's early atmosphere with electricity to simulate maybe a lightning strike. They heat it up to simulate thermal events at the bottom of the ocean, and they cycle it over and over again. Heat, cool, shock, and they do that over and over and over again. And when they do this, they can take these basic, simple inorganic molecules and make some, not all, but some of the basic organic molecules that are necessary for life. So we don't know all of the steps, but certainly we can understand some of the possible steps that could have been taken and would have occurred in Earth's early atmosphere to create the basic building blocks of life. Okay. And in fact, not only that, but if we take simple RNA strands and we put them in the correct conditions, we get a very interesting thing occurring. So RNA of different types will self-replicate. Now, some of those RNA molecules are a little better at self-replicating than others, and we don't need replicase, which is an enzyme, a protein, that living organisms use to copy their RNA. But we don't need any replicases. RNA will auto-catalyze, will make copies of itself. And it turns out that some, as I mentioned, some strings of RNA are better at making copies of themselves than others. And so if we run an experiment where we take a diverse pool of RNAs represented by these little green shapes here and allow them to self-replicate, then take a subsample and do it again and again and again, eventually we select out the molecules that are not very good at copying themselves. They can't make as many copies, so they're underrepresented in each cycle. The ones that make good copies are overrepresented, and eventually we end up maybe even with just one type of RNA strand that's very good at copying itself. Now, if we look at this, this looks very much like natural selection. Now, if we're going to be very technical, we may not call it natural selection because it's not in a living organism, right? It doesn't qualify as a force of evolution because they're molecules not yet classified as living organisms. But this could have created some of these key building blocks and made eventually fairly long, complex chains of RNA that were the beginning, the first elements leading to living organisms. So our current hypothesis is that these ideas about life on Earth, that life began, or at least proto-life, right, before we have living organisms, began as RNA molecules that could self-replicate. Now, many of the steps of how we go from RNA to DNA, how we get DNA and proteins, right, these amino acids connected together, are still under investigation. And honestly, there are many, many big gaps in our understanding. We do our best to try and replicate early Earth conditions, but maybe we're not 100% accurate. We don't know all of the physical conditions that could lead to living organisms. We don't know many of the steps that are along the way. So major hurdles that still need to be studied and understood are how we get RNA and DNA so connected. We've already kind of established that RNA was probably the original self-replicating molecule. In fact, some people call this prebiotic Earth an RNA world. As we begin to make more and more efficient RNA molecules, and we have chemical reactions going on that look a little bit like natural selection, but no living organisms. Eventually, we get RNA and DNA connected together so that RNA is necessary to create the proteins to make DNA. DNA is necessary to forms the major molecule, the repository of genetic information, so we can make RNA. And then, of course, these nucleic acids, proteins, how we get the RNA and DNA, which are nucleic acids, how we get them connected to the proteins, and we get this very complex chemical reaction that is life on Earth. And we don't really have the time or the need to go into a lot of detail, but there's lots of ongoing research, but many, many major gaps in our understanding of how we go from one step to the next. But eventually, we get these very complex clusters of molecules that form the first living cells. And those first cells appear on Earth. Now, the date that I have here, I've put a star by because this is really a minimum date. In fact, there's very, very good evidence now that it probably occurred as much as 3.8 billion years ago. So I'm going to put a 3.8 billion years, and some people even put it a little bit farther back than that. So I left that there to remind me, and we're going to update it. So the first life on Earth appears about 3.8 billion years ago. Now, the data that we use to do this are the very first fossils that we can find. The oldest fossils on Earth, and this is an image of modern stromatolites, which are these colonial bacteria that all live together and form these very distinctive shapes. And we can see those shapes in the earliest fossils. So almost certainly the very first living organisms of life on Earth were single-celled bacteria, and we probably don't have fossils of those because they're so small. It's very hard to fossilize a single cell. But eventually those cells start clustering together and forming colonies. We get different species evolving, and we end up with things that are more easily preserved in the fossil record. So even 3.8 billion years is a minimum date, and it was probably even earlier than that, but we don't have good fossil evidence. So our earliest fossils are 3.8 billion years. Now, at the beginning of unit 3.3, I'm sorry, the end of 1.32, we're going to look at fossils, relative dating, and how we do this. And there's a little bit of a catch-22 when we're dating fossils, but we'll get to that at a later date. So just make sure you know when life first appeared on Earth, and that the data we use to do that is relative dating of the oldest fossils. Now, all life on Earth, as we established in our first discussion, is related to all other life. So there is an ancient connection, sometimes more ancient, sometimes less ancient, but there's an ancient connection between all species. An exception to this rule, and you learn this in Bio 1, may be viruses, and there's still some uncertainty about viruses. Most people do not classify viruses as living organisms. However, they share many common characteristics with living organisms, and so there's a little bit of a puzzle still with viruses. So let's deal with viruses first. There are three main hypotheses, ideas, about where viruses come from. And these different hypotheses have various levels of support, but there's no clear consensus as to which of these is correct. So let's define each of them, and then we'll talk about maybe resolving or understanding why there's no clear consensus for these three. The first one is called the escaped genes hypothesis. And this is the idea that viruses represent a portion of a once living organism that escaped, so to speak, or got separated from a living organism. So imagine an early bacterium. It dies and breaks apart, but a portion of it remains, and that portion that remains is able to kind of hijack and live in other cells and becomes the very first viruses. So basically a remnant of a once living cell. The reduction hypothesis, number 2, is somewhat similar. But basically, the reduction hypothesis is a step-by-step evolution towards that same end result of a virus. And a virus is a non-living entity that hijacks the replication mechanisms of living organisms, and often will be destructive or detrimental, but not always. And so this reduction is a step-by-step evolution, but both escape genes hypothesis and reduction hypothesis hypothesize that viruses started as part of life on Earth, but then changed either drastically, as in our first hypothesis, or step-by-step slowly into our modern viruses, but they are at some level connected to living organisms directly. The last one is a separate origin for viruses. That viruses may be the beginnings of a second origin of life on Earth, but never were able to make it all the way to what we would classify as living organisms. So under this hypothesis, there is no direct connection. It's a separate origin for viruses. Now, which of these is the correct one? And the answer is we don't know, but it might be all of the above. And so there are many, many different types of viruses. Viruses are a very diverse group of entities, again, not classified as living, but they're very diverse. There are RNA viruses, DNA viruses, some are single-stranded, some are double-stranded, some they're retrovirus. Anyway, a huge variety. And so some of those may have evolved by hypothesis number 1, and others might have evolved by 2, others may have even evolved by 3. So it could be all 3 or 2 of the above, but we still don't have any clear evidence. So just be aware of those 3 hypotheses and know that it's possible that different viruses may have arisen by different avenues. Okay, so now on to living organisms. Now, as we look at the rest of these characteristics of living organisms, these major milestones in life on Earth, we're going to see a common theme. And we're going to call this an emergent property. A non-biological word for emergent property is synergy. And you might have come across that word before in a business world or in some other context. An emergent property or synergy is where we take a bunch of different elements and we put them together, and that allows us to do something brand new that individually we couldn't do before. So for instance, a colony of ants can do all sorts of things that would be impossible if they were not connected and working together in such a complex manner. And sometimes these emergent properties are very complex and maybe even difficult or impossible to predict just by looking at the components. But when we get those components together, we get new things that are possible that maybe weren't even predictable by looking at just the basic components. And you'll see this over and over again, whether we're talking about the origin of cells, right, from individual molecules, or whether we're talking about the origin of multicellular organisms from those individual cells, we get new possibilities and new characteristics that were impossible before we merged together those different things. And this question of how we go from one state, simple, to a more complex organized state is a very, very difficult one. There's no single clear answer for that. It's going to be different for different things. And sometimes we know many of the steps or even all of the steps of how we go from one to the other, but other times there's still gaps in our understanding and knowledge, and we still need to do a lot more work or gather more data to figure that out. So the 4th milestone of life that we're going to talk about is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis appears in the fossil record about 3.2 billion years ago. And again, some people put that back a little bit farther, which is why there's an asterisk by that. But we see photosynthesis about 3.2 billion years ago. Now, what's the data? How do we know that it occurred that early? Well, this is fairly soon, relatively soon, right? Only a couple 100 million years after the origin of life on Earth. A few 100 million years, right? Maybe, 600 million years or so, 500 million years or so after life on Earth originates, we have photosynthesis. Now, those early photosynthesizers, and this is important, the first photosynthesizers were bacteria, probably very similar to today's modern cyanobacteria. In fact, the cyanobacteria, as we've got imaged down here, are the descendants still very similar to the very first photosynthesizers. And they were single-celled, tiny organisms. They didn't fossilize. And so we don't have direct fossil evidence of the first photosynthesizers. But what we do have are sedimentary rocks that were deposited during that time. And this is an image of some of these early sedimentary rocks that are right at this boundary of where photosynthesis begins to occur. And if you look at these rocks, you notice something very distinct that we don't see in earlier sedimentary rocks. We see this first about 3.2 or 3.3 billion years ago, and these are called iron bands or red bands. So this very red, deep color in these rocks is iron oxide. And prior to this, there was lots of iron in the sedimentary rocks, just like there is today, but this iron was not oxidized. It wasn't rusty, right? It didn't have oxygen bound to it, which is a very common reaction that occurs in our modern atmosphere because oxygen is so present. But if you look back at the prebiotic Earth atmosphere, there was very little oxygen. It was just a trace element. And oxygen is so reactive that as soon as it's present with any sort of chemical it can react with, it will form oxides, oxidation reactions, and we get that O2 molecule being incorporated in other molecules. And so we see these rust bands for the first time about 3.2 billion years ago. And this is our date for photosynthesis because the oxygen, the free oxygen in our atmosphere today comes from photosynthesis. And so when we first see photosynthesis, we get more oxygen being released in the atmosphere and we end up with essentially rust in the sedimentary rocks. Okay, so 3.2 or so billion years ago, and we date this by getting dates for these early red bands or iron oxide bands in our sedimentary rocks. The fifth great event, milestone of life on Earth we're going to talk about is called the Great Oxygenation Event. Now, this really, we're going to put a date on it, but really this is a long, involved process that really kind of begins to reach its stable point about 2.5 billion years ago, but is ongoing. So really, if you want to, you could think of this as an event that occurs from the origin of photosynthesis 3.2 billion years ago all the way to about 2.5 billion years ago. So almost a billion years of the Great Oxygenation Event. And essentially what this is a buildup of oxygen in the environment. So as photosynthesis occurs, we're going to have more and more oxygen that is pumped out into the atmosphere. And this oxygen is going to build up until it finds a reaction. And at the early stages, all the oxygen got pulled into those oxidation reactions, and so really it didn't build up in the atmosphere at all. And so even though photosynthesis is making all this oxygen and pumping it out into the environment, it was all immediately used up and deposited or locked away in more complex molecules. But eventually, about 2.5 billion years ago, we begin to see saturation. And so all of the oxidation reactions are saturated, and so free oxygen can begin to build up in the environment. And so from 2.5 billion years ago all the way until about 1.5 billion years ago, we get oxygen accumulating until we reach kind of modern levels of quite high oxygen. And there are still some fluctuations. It goes up and down, but we're at now high levels of oxygen. And so we know this by looking at the fossil record. Now, this is the last date we're going to do in this discussion. We'll hit a couple other major events in the next discussion. But for all of the events after this, and including this one, the data that we use, how do we know, is relative dating of fossils, right? So we can look at chemical composition of sedimentary rocks, but more importantly, we look at the fossils we find in those rocks, and then we get dates for those. And we'll talk about exactly how we arrive at those dates. But relative dating of fossil evidence is going to be the data that we use to support all of the dates after this one. Okay, so look at lecture 1.32. We'll finish up our major milestones of life, and then in 1.33, we'll highlight and talk about some of the important groups of organisms when they evolved and why they're important.